Welcome back. Today we're going to talk about Chapter 14, Cultural Influences on Consumer Behavior. There are 8 learning objectives in this chapter. We're going to talk about how culture is likely a society's personality and how it shapes our identities as individuals, and how values and norms distinguish one culture from another. We'll also talk about myths and rituals and how they differ across cultures, and how marketers capitalize on them, and how many of our consumption activities related to holidays, grooming, and gift giving are rituals. We'll also talk about how products can be sacred or profane, and how some move back and forth between categories. In the second half of the chapter, we'll talk more about how new products, services, and ideas spread through the population, and why different types of people are more or less likely to adopt them. We'll finish up by discussing how many people and organizations play a role in the fashion system that creates and communicates symbolic meaning to consumers, and the various models of fashion that can be used to predict. So what is culture? Culture is like a society's personality. It includes its abstract ideas, like its values and ethics, as well as its material objects, like the cars people drive, the clothing they wear, the food they eat, their art, and the sports they enjoy. Culture is a society's shared meanings, their rituals, norms, and traditions. For example, driving on the right or left-hand side of the road, bowing or shaking hands when meeting someone. Sometimes culture is hard to grasp until we encounter another one. Culture is pervasive. It impacts everything in our lives, from language to the clothes we wear. It's functional and it's learned. For example, we learn to stop at a red traffic light to avoid accidents. And it's dynamic. It's constantly changing. For example, think about how cell phone technology and texting have become such a big part of our lives over the past number of years. Products used by a society can tell us a lot about its culture. They often reflect underlying cultural processes of a particular period. For example, the TV dinner represented changes in family structure as more women started working. Cosmetics made of natural materials without animal testing tell us about the values that are important to a culture, like animal rights and environmental sustainability. And pastel carrying cases for condoms signal changes in attitudes towards sexual responsibility and frankness, about birth control and disease prevention. There are 3 functional areas or ways to describe a culture. First, it's ecology, the way it's adapted to its environment. For example, the Japanese value the efficient use of space because of the cramped conditions as an island nation. Vancouverites value the outdoors due to the natural beauty of the West Coast. Many locals ski, cycle, hike, and run as a result. And the abundance of trees and proximity to the ocean, our natural resources, affect our industry. Second, it's social structure, how orderly social life is maintained. For example, the dominant political and domestic groups. Perhaps it's the nuclear family, or maybe the extended family. And finally, it's ideology, the mental characteristics of the people, and how they relate to their environment and social groups. For example, their worldview, their principles of order and fairness, and their ethos, their morals and aesthetic principles, the mood and the character or spirit of the people. It explains the way they do things and why they do things that way. Many values are universal. For example, the importance of family, health, happiness, and wisdom. What sets cultures apart is which values are seen as being relatively more important, how they're prioritized. Core values can be usually identified for each culture. For example, North Americans value freedom, youthfulness, and achievement. On the other hand, the Japanese will trade some independence for security and hygiene. For example, it's common in Japan for communities to post guards on school routes and parents to place GPS devices and safety buzzers in kids' backpacks. There are also many indoor parks with uniformed monitors and security cameras and antibacterial sand. Visitors require ID, and stroller wheels are sprayed with antibacterial soap. A marketing message appealing in one culture may not be appealing in another. For example, stories are often told about how Pepsodent tried to sell their toothpaste in Southeast Asia by emphasizing how it whitened teeth, but local natives chew betel nuts, the seed of the Eureka palm tree, to blacken their teeth and find it attractive. Every culture has cultural norms. Norms are rules dictating what's right or wrong in a society. They may be enacted norms or oppressive norms. Enacted norms are explicitly decided. For example, stopping at red traffic lights and proceeding on a green light. Oppressive norms are embedded in a culture. The word oppressive comes from the Latin word crescere, which means to grow by gradual, spontaneous development. There are three types of oppressive norms: customs, mores, and conventions. Customs are norms handed down from the past that control basic behavior. For example, dinner hour in Canada is between 5 and 7 p.m., and not until after 9 in Spain. Mores are customs with a strong moral overtone. For example, what kind of food is permissible to eat? Eating beef is common in North America, but not in India where the cow is sacred, and dog is common in Korea, but not in North America or India. Conventions are norms regarding the conduct of everyday life, the subtleties of consumer behavior, like table etiquette and proper dinner attire. For example, in Canada, people tend to eat with a knife and fork, while in Japan, people use chopsticks, and in Morocco, people use their fingers, but only using their right hand thumb and first and second fingers. Using more is a sign of gluttony. All three oppressive norms combine to define culturally appropriate behavior. One of the most widely used measures of cross-cultural values is an instrument developed by Geert Hofstede, a Dutch researcher. It scores a country in terms of its standing on 6 dimensions: power distance, uncertainty avoidance, masculinity, individualism, long-term orientation, and indulgence. Power distance refers to the way members perceive differences in power when they form interpersonal relationships. It describes how hierarchical a society is. For example, Canada stresses a high degree of equality and lower power distance, whereas Japan emphasizes strict vertical relationships and higher power distance. Uncertainty avoidance refers to the extent members feel threatened by ambiguous or unknown situations and have created beliefs and institutions that try to avoid these. A rule-oriented society that institutes many laws, rules, regulations, and controls to reduce the amount of uncertainty is higher in uncertainty avoidance. For example, Japan, Chile, and Uruguay have high uncertainty avoidance, while Singapore and Malaysia have low uncertainty avoidance. Masculinity refers to the degree to which sex roles are clearly delineated. More traditional societies are likely to possess very explicit roles about behavior of men and women. Highly masculine countries value traits like competition, assertiveness, and dominance, and segregate gender roles. For example, Japan and South Africa are highly masculine, while the Netherlands and Sweden are more feminine. Individualism refers to the degree of interdependence a society maintains among members. In a collectivist culture, people attach more importance to the goals of the in-group. They subordinate their goals to that of the group, while individualist countries attach more importance to personal goals. They're more likely to change memberships when the demands of the group, like a church or a workplace, become too costly. For example, Canada, US, Australia, and the UK are more individualistic, while Taiwan and Thailand are more collectivist. Long-term orientation, or pragmatism, refers to a society's focus on future rewards, perseverance and thrift, versus values linked to the past, respect for tradition. For example, Germany, South Korea, and Japan have a longer-term, more pragmatic orientation. Japan's long-term orientation is seen in the constant high rate of investment in R&D, even in difficult economic times. Companies are not there to make money every quarter for shareholders, but to serve stakeholders in society for many generations to come. On the other hand, Egypt, Ghana, and Nigeria have a shorter-term orientation. Indulgence is the extent to which people try to control their desires and impulses. For example, Canada scores higher on indulgence than India. We tend to be more willing to focus on enjoying life and having fun. So how does Canada stack up against Japan and India? Well, Canada is much less hierarchical than India, with scores of 39 and 77 respectively. Japan is somewhere in between. Canada is much more individualistic than both India and Japan, with a score of 80, almost double that of Japan and India. Japan stands out as a very masculine society, with high uncertainty avoidance and a longer-term, more pragmatic orientation, with scores almost double that of both India and Japan in all three categories. Canada is much more indulgent than India, with a score of 68 versus 26, and Japan lies somewhere in between. Every culture develops stories and practices that help make sense of the world. Sometimes a culture's myths or rituals can seem kind of bizarre. For example, the power of lucky number 7, or a rabbit's foot. According to some, it should be the left hind foot of a rabbit shot in a cemetery during a full moon or a new moon to be lucky. We even have software wizards that have been designed to guide people using computers, and many people scramble to take advantage of lucky date 070707. For example, Mandalay Bay Casino hosted group weddings for over 100 people on July 7, 2007. This included a reception of 77 people, a 7-tier wedding cake, and a 7-night honeymoon at any Ritz-Carlton in the world, all for $77,777. Beliefs are culture-centric and take on different forms around the world. For example, the number 8, pronounced ba, is lucky in China because it sounds like wealth, pronounced fa. We also see myths and rituals involving magical products that give us easy answers and simplify our lives. For example, miracle foods that prevent disease, cosmetics that magically reduce the signs of aging, folk cures for colds and flus, or forms of exercise to fight aging and disease, like the 4-minute workout that claims you can get better fitness gains than an entire hour of running on the treadmill. So what is a myth? A myth is a story containing symbolic elements that represent the shared emotions or ideals of a culture. There's usually a conflict between two opposing forces, and it may or may not be true. The outcome of the story tends to provide a moral guide for people and helps reduce anxiety. For example, the story of Little Red Riding Hood from the 16th century. In the original story, when Little Red Riding Hood arrived at Grandma's house, the wolf had already killed Grandma, stored her flesh in the pantry, and poured her blood into a bottle. Little Red Riding Hood snacks on Granny, drinks her blood, strips naked, and gets into bed with the wolf. There's historical evidence of a plague of wolf attacks during the time, and men were put on trial for changing themselves into deadly mythical creatures. This was a warning to loose ladies of the time to abstain from promiscuity. The color red was symbolic of the harlots of the day, prostitutes or promiscuous women. Marketers create and play upon myths too. For example, McDonald's takes on mythical qualities, telling stories in ads about the struggles between Ronald McDonald and Hamburglar, and employees can attend Hamburger University. There are also the Nike legends about the Oregon coach Bill Bowerman, who created the first waffle sole by pouring rubber into his family waffle iron. This story is told by corporate storytellers and posted on the company website. We generally associate myths with the ancient Greeks and the Romans, but modern myths are often found in comic books, movies like Twilight, holidays like Christmas with stories of Santa Claus, and even in commercials. Some people even create their own consumer fairy tales. For example, a Cinderella wedding at Disney World. The bride wears a tiara and rides in a horse-drawn carriage with two footmen in gray wigs and gold lame pants. Trumpets blare, and the wedding rings are presented in a glass slipper. A monomyth is a myth that is common to many cultures. A hero often emerges to win over evil. For example, comic book heroes like Superman and Spider-Man. Myths can also be built on in marketing. For example, Kokanee beer and stories of the mythical Sasquatch. Myths serve four interrelated functions in a culture: metaphysical, cosmological, sociological, and psychological. The metaphysical function helps explain the origin of existence. It awakens a sense of awe about the mystery of being. For example, the story of the vanishing hitchhiker. A doctor was driving home late one night just outside of Baltimore. He slowed down as he approached a dangerous intersection and saw a lovely young girl standing at the side of the road, beckoning him for a ride. He pulled over and asked why she was out so late, all alone. She explained it was a long story and asked him to take her home. She got in the back seat as there wasn't any room in the front with his golf clubs, and gave the doctor her address. As he pulled up to the girl's house, he turned around to say, "Here we are," but the girl had vanished. Bewildered, he went up to the house and rang the doorbell. A gray-haired, very tired old man answered, and he explained the story. But before he could finish, the man interrupted. Yes, I know. This has happened several other Saturday evenings in the past few months. That young girl was my daughter. She was killed in a car accident at that intersection where you saw her, almost 2 years ago. Perhaps this story awakens your sense of awe. The cosmological function emphasizes all components of the universe or cosmos are part of a single picture. It explains the shape of the universe or the processes of nature. For example, the story about the Tower of Babel. The people of Babel were descendants of Noah and riders of the ark that rescued them from the great flood that plagued the world for 40 days and nights. Once they reached land, they were to separate into tribes in separate regions. That was God's plan. Instead, they decided to build a tower to protect themselves against another great flood, or perhaps to ascend to God. No one knows for sure. God came down to the earth to give them a nudge, so to speak. He confused their language, making each clan understand each other but no one else. They had no choice but to separate and abide by God's plan. Perhaps this explains why we speak so many different languages today. The sociological function helps maintain social order by authorizing a social code to be followed. It validates and supports the existing order. For example, the story of Little Red Riding Hood's reinforcement of respectable conduct for promiscuous women of the day. The story of Pandora's box is another example of the sociological function, perhaps encouraging the young to do as they're told. Zeus had told Pandora not to open the box, but she did, and unleashed sin on the world. The psychological function provides models for personal conduct. It guides the individual through the stages of life. It explains how to live a full, happy life. For example, the story of the prodigal son. A certain man had 2 sons. The younger son asked for his inheritance and wastes it away on riotous living and harlots. With no money, he goes hungry during a famine. He repents and goes home to his father, who has a feast to celebrate. The older son was angry and refused to participate. He was so dedicated to his father and never had such a feast. The father explained that he is always with him and that all that he has is his. Your brother was dead and is alive again, lost and now found. That's why we're celebrating. No matter how badly we mess up in life, it seems, we're not beyond forgiveness and redemption. We can get back on track. Consumer activity can be characterized as sacred or profane consumption. Sacred consumption involves objects and events that are set apart from normal activities and are treated with respect or awe. They aren't necessarily religious, but they're valuable. For example, concert tickets to see a famous singer, a prestigious platinum credit card, or maybe even a trip to Las Vegas. Profane consumption involves consumer objects and events that are ordinary and not special. It doesn't mean vulgar or obscene in this context. For example, shopping for groceries or everyday items. Sacralization occurs when ordinary objects, events, and people take on sacred meaning. They're treated with respect or awe. For example, the Stanley Cup Finals. Some guys refuse to shave until the cup is won, and Elvis Presley is sacred for many fans. Sacralization takes place through objectification, when sacred qualities are attributed to mundane items. This may be either due to contamination, just being associated with sacred events or people, or by collections. For example, Beatles t-shirts and other memorabilia may become sacred due to their association with the famous band through contamination. In collections, even mundane, inexpensive things may be set apart, transformed from profane or ordinary to sacred. For example, spoon collections or Barbie doll collections. Collecting refers to the systematic acquisition of a particular object or set of objects. On the other hand, hoarding refers to unsystematically collecting anything. Desacralization takes place when a sacred item or symbol is removed from its special place or is duplicated in mass quantities. It becomes profane. For example, the thousands of souvenir reproductions of sacred monuments like the Eiffel Tower or the Statue of Liberty. Even religion has become somewhat desacralized. For example, stylized crosses and New Age crystals have moved into the mainstream of fashion jewelry. Christmas and Ramadan are now secular or mainstream, materialistic occasions. And even clergy, like ministers, are adopting mainstream marketing techniques. For example, televangelists rely on the power of TV to convey their messages to the masses. Rituals are not just about animal or virgin sacrifices. Rituals are sets of multiple symbolic behaviors that occur in a fixed sequence and that tend to be repeated periodically. Many consumer activities are ritualistic. For example, regular Friday afternoon trips to Starbucks or pulling the perfect pint of Guinness. The traditional slow pour takes exactly 119.5 seconds to pour, should be filled 3/4 full at a 45-degree angle, left to settle, and then topped with creamy head. Guinness introduced fast pour ultrasonic technology to reduce the pour to 25 seconds so bars could serve more drinks on busy nights, but it had to be scrapped as drinkers were used to their rituals. There are also college campus rituals, for example, tailgating at football games, drinking alcoholic beverages, and grilling food around the tailgate of a truck in a parking lot at stadiums and arenas. Many businesses supply ritual artifacts, items needed to perform rituals to consumers. For example, wedding rice, birthday candles, diplomas, hot dogs at baseball games, and retirement watches. Wedding rice is evolving because it's often eaten by birds and later expands, causing injury or even death. For example, bio-wedding rice dissolves rather than expands. Some are opting for butterflies over rice. Hole in Hand Butterfly Farm in Pennsylvania ships newly hatched butterflies at $100 a dozen. They arrive in a dark, cool envelope to keep in resting stage until opened, when they fly out in a burst of color. Diamond rings are also typically bought by men for engagement or weddings. De Beers introduced the right-hand ring to add extra purchasing opportunities for women. It was positioned as a symbol of self-respect and independence. Magazine ads read, "Your left hand says we, your right hand says me. Your left hand loves candlelight, your right hand loves the spotlight. Your left hand rocks the cradle, your right hand rules the world. Women of the world, raise your right hand." Consumers often employ ritual scripts that identify the artifacts, the sequence in which they're used, and who uses them. For example, graduation programs and etiquette books. All consumers have private grooming rituals, maybe brushing your hair 100 strokes a day, or talking to yourself in the mirror in the morning. They aid the transition from the private self to the public self and back again. Grooming rituals serve various purposes, ranging from inspiring confidence to cleansing the body of dirt. Consumers often talk about a before and after phenomenon similar to Cinderella, being magically transformed after using certain products. Some companies understand the power of these rituals and supply the artifacts we need to make them happen. For example, Nair hair removal for teenage girls. Nair conducted focus groups that revealed when a teenage girl removes hair for the first time, it's often a life-changing experience. Some even have hair removal slumber parties. The company introduced Nair Pretty specifically for teens as a result. Gift giving is also a ritual. For example, consumers look for the perfect object, meticulously remove the price tag, carefully wrap it, and then deliver it to the recipient. Gift giving may be a form of economic exchange or symbolic exchange. For example, we sometimes feel obligated to reciprocate. Other times, we may feel motivated by unselfish factors like love or adoration. Gift giving may also evolve as a form of social expression. Some researchers believe gift giving is more exchange-oriented or instrumental in the early stages of a relationship and more altruistic as the relationship develops. Every culture prescribes certain occasions and ceremonies for gift giving. For example, birthdays and weddings. Chinese New Year is also a time for gift giving. Traditional red packets filled with money called Hong Bao in Mandarin and Lai Si in Cantonese are usually given to singles by married couples. The color red is a symbol of good luck and wards off evil spirits. Gift giving is often an important part of doing business. They're often given to define or maintain professional relationships or improve employee morale and may result in higher sales. There are 3 stages in a gift-giving ritual: gestation, presentation, and reformulation. In gestation, the giver is motivated by an event to procure a gift. For example, a structural event prescribed by culture, like Christmas, or perhaps an emergent motivational event. For example, something personal like, "I just wanted to say I love you." The presentation is the process of the gift exchange. During reformulation, the bonds between the giver and the receiver may be adjusted. The receiver may assess the appropriateness or quality of the gift. For example, it may be negative if a husband gives his wife a vacuum for their anniversary. On the other hand, the donor may feel that the reciprocity norm was violated if he received an inadequate or insincere response to his gift. Most holidays are based on a myth with a character at the center of a story. For example, Cupid on Valentine's Day, and consumers perform rituals unique to these occasions. For example, Thanksgiving dinner rituals include a turkey and cranberry sauce and complaining about overeating afterwards. On Valentine's Day, the standards about love and sex are relaxed. It's an opportunity to express hidden feelings during the rest of the year. Businesses invent new occasions to capitalize on the need for cards and ritual artifacts, a reason to buy. For example, Secretary's Day and Grandparents' Day. Rites of passage usually involve rituals too, ceremonies or events marking an important stage or passage in someone's life. They're special times marked by a change in social status and often involve many consumer activities. For example, puberty, death, divorce, and dating, or a bar mitzvah for young Jewish boys and a bat mitzvah for young girls. Much like the metamorphosis of a caterpillar into a butterfly, consumers' rites of passage consist of three phases: separation, liminality, the phase between statuses similar to the cocooning of a butterfly, and aggregation. For example, a student leaves home, arrives on campus during orientation week, and the transformation begins. They later return home in summer as a university veteran. Athletes and models go through a similar seasoning process. For example, athletes go to training camps while models go to Paris. Another big part of culture is language and symbols. Language barriers across cultures can create problems. For example, travelers often encounter English signage that's been translated incorrectly. In a Tokyo hotel, a sign invited guests to take advantage of the chambermaid. In Acapulco, the manager had personally passed all of the water. And at a Mallorca dry cleaner, customers were told to drop your pants here for the best results. Back translation may help avoid problems, translating from one language into the target language and back again to catch errors. Here are some errors that could have used a bit of back translation. Fresca is Mexican slang for lesbian. Fiera Ford truck means ugly old woman in Spanish. Pinto is slang for small male appendage in Brazil. Vix is German slang for sexual intercourse. Gudvik is a children's bed from IKEA named after a tiny town in Sweden, but sounds like a German phrase about sex. And the fartful workbench and jerker computer table from IKEA have not yet been explained. A symbol is an object that represents something else. For example, numbers, gestures, and colors are symbols. Their meanings vary across cultures and can cause problems if not used appropriately. For example, sets of 4 golf balls were introduced in Japan, but the number 4 is associated with death. Light blue vending machines were introduced in Southeast Asia, but light blue is also associated with death in Southeast Asia. And AT&T's Thumbs Up campaign in Russia and Poland involved gestures seen as obscene, loosely translated as "up yours." When marketing across different cultures, either a standardized one-size-fits-all strategy or a localized strategy can be used. For example, Procter & Gamble often adopts a standardized strategy, finding large segments in many countries who share the same outlooks, style preferences, and aspirations, like teenagers, working women, and baby boomers, for example. A standardized strategy represents an etic perspective or an outsider's view. It involves developing one approach for multiple homogenized markets and focuses on cultural commonalities. Users benefit from economies of scale. They don't have to invest time and money into developing separate strategies for each country. Heineken has used a standardized strategy by promoting their beer as an international icon. Magazine ads explain, "Wherever you go, it's always nice to see something you recognize. The green bottle, the red star, and the smiling E telling you instantly what's inside. Cold, fresh, quality Heineken, enjoyed around the world since 1873. Teenage girls everywhere have the same concerns about puberty, so Procter & Gamble can talk to them on beinggirl.com and make the content available in 40 countries without reinventing the wheel in each market. This is a good example of a standardized strategy. Disney learned some cultural lessons from Disneyland Paris. For example, when they opened, they only sold French sausages, and the Italians and Germans complained. They were slammed for recreating their American locations without catering to local customs. Guided tours were modified to include narration by Jeremy Irons in English, Isabella Rossellini in Italian, and Nastasia Kinski in German. In Hong Kong Disneyland, feng shui specialists were consulted to help adapt to the local culture. They shifted the angle of the front gate by 12 degrees, added a lucky 888 square meter ballroom, and put a bend in the walkway from the train station to the gate to make sure the flow of energy, or qi, was positive. They also served Chinese shark fin soup at wedding banquets, but activists raised a ruckus as it's an endangered species. Maybe Disney was trying too hard. An emic perspective, or insider's view, stresses variations across cultures. As each country is unique and has a national character, marketers adopt a localized strategy. Strategies are tailored to various cultures to make products acceptable to local tastes. So when does global marketing work best? To find out, marketers often conduct cross-cultural analysis. Cross-cultural analysis examines the degree to which two cultures are different or similar, so we can adapt the strategy accordingly. Consumers in different countries don't always use products in the same way. For example, Kellogg's found that Brazilians don't eat large breakfasts. They often eat cereal as a dry snack. And IKEA promotes patio furniture in Canada while promoting curling up on the couch in Australia due to seasonal variations. Significant cultural differences can even show up within the same country. For example, ads in Montreal tend to be a lot racier than Toronto. They reflect different attitudes to sexuality between those with French versus British roots. Some large companies are successful in crafting a single international image. It's important to find consumers with a common worldview to maximize the chance of success. This is more likely to be those with a more international or cosmopolitan frame of reference, or who receive information about the world from sources that incorporate a worldwide perspective. For example, Coke ads are largely standardized. However, Coke permits close-ups of local faces and minor modifications in each market. Consumers vary in their attitudes toward global brands. 4 major market segments were identified based on global brand attributes in a study of 41 countries: global citizens, global dreamers, anti-globals, and global agnostics. 2 segments, representing over 3/4 of consumers, tended to like global brands: the global citizens and the global dreamers. The anti-globals and the agnostics didn't feel quite the same. Global citizens represent 55% of consumers. They see the size and reach of a global company as a sign of success, but are concerned about their social and environmental responsibilities. Global dreamers represent 23% of consumers. They see global brands as high quality and are not as concerned with social responsibility. Anti-globals are a smaller segment. They only represent 13% of consumers and avoid transnational brands and companies. They dislike brands that preach American values and don't trust them to act responsibly. Global agnostics are also a small segment. They represent just 9% of consumers. They evaluate all brands the same, no matter of origin. They're apathetic or indifferent. In Chapter 1, we learned that people often buy products for what they mean, not what they do. The culture we live in creates meaning for everyday products, and these meanings move through society to consumers. For example, a cross is a symbol of Christianity, and a gold ring is a symbol of marital commitment. There are 2 points of transfer. Advertising and fashion systems move meaning from cultural values and symbols to consumer goods. For example, Marlboro ads transfer cultural values of masculinity to cigarettes, with images of strong, confident men. Consumption rituals then move meaning from consumer goods to the individual consumer. For example, a young man may smoke Marlboro cigarettes to reinforce his masculinity. Cultural selection refers to the selection of certain alternatives over others. It's a complex filtering process, and what's hot this year may be out next year. So what are some of the characteristics of fashion and pop culture? Well, it's constantly changing, choices are constantly evolving, and cultural products and trends travel widely. This is fueled by the internet and social media. Influential people are often involved in deciding what will succeed, like retail buyers and book publishers, for example. Styles are often first adopted by smaller groups who are willing to take some risk, then spread as others become aware and more confident. And most styles eventually wear out or are replaced with something new. No single designer, company, or ad agency is totally responsible for pop culture. Inputs needed from many different participants. Whether it's a hit song, a car, or a new clothing style, there's a cultural production system, a set of individuals and organizations that are responsible for creating and marketing a cultural product. 2 important factors impact the types of products that emerge. First, the number and diversity of competing systems. For example, country and western hit songs are more similar when dominated by fewer large companies, and there's more variety when more producers are competing. And second, the amount of innovation that's encouraged in the industry. This also has an impact on the types of products that emerge. There are 3 major components of a cultural production system: the creative, managerial, and communication subsystems. The creative subsystem generates new symbols or products. For example, Beyoncé and other recording artists sing, they create music. The managerial subsystem selects what's hot and what's not and makes it tangible, then mass produces it and manages distribution. For example, Columbia Records distributes Beyoncé's albums. The communication subsystem gives meaning to the products and provides symbolic attributes to communicate to consumers. For example, ad agencies and corporations like PepsiCo work with Beyoncé's company, Parkwood Entertainment. They promote her music and arrange for appearances in venues like the Super Bowl and even on limited edition sets of Pepsi pop cans. Cultural gatekeepers, or tastemakers, influence the products eventually offered to consumers. They're the judges responsible for filtering the overflow of information and materials. These gatekeepers are known as the throughput sector. For example, movie, restaurant, and car critics, interior designers, disc jockeys at radio stations, retail buyers for stores, and magazine editors. Customers and fans are playing an increasing role, too, using crowdsourcing models. For example, companies like Threadless Tees crowdsource ideas for new designs. Each week, 1,000 t-shirt designs are submitted by artists and put to public vote. Staff review the designs based on community feedback, and 10 designs are selected. The top designers receive $2,000, and the t-shirts are sold out every time. So how do all of these elements work together in the cultural production process? Well, the creative subsystem generates new symbols or products, like Beyoncé's music. The managerial subsystem mass produces and manages distribution. For example, Columbia Records distributes Beyoncé's albums. The communication subsystem gives meaning to products and communicates to consumers, promoting Beyoncé's music and arranging appearances. Together, these subsystems make up the cultural production system. Cultural gatekeepers then influence the products that are offered. For example, disc jockeys and radio station program directors influence how often a new song is played. Informal gatekeepers may also have an influence. Opinion leaders, friends, family, and neighbors, for example. Meanwhile, consumers are constantly providing input into the symbol pool that the creative subsystem draws on through social media or maybe by uploading new t-shirt designs for Threadless. Mass culture is disseminated by mass media. It churns out products for the mass market, in contrast to high art or high culture associated with the elite. The aim is to please the average taste of an undifferentiated audience. It's predictable and follows a certain cultural formula. For example, certain roles and props often occur consistently in romance or detective novels. The damsel in distress, or the persecuted maiden are classic themes in world literature. A beautiful young woman in a dire predicament by a villain or a monster who requires a hero to save her. Reliance on cultural formula leads to the recycling of images. Creative subsystem members reach back through time for inspiration. For example, retro shows like 90210, Spider-Man remakes, and remixing of songs from the past. DJs often sample sound bites from old songs and combine in new and interesting ways. Product placement is about the insertion of products and the use of brand names in movies and TV scripts. Marketers pay about $25 billion a year to plug brands in TV shows and movies. For example, in the movie version of Sex and the City, Carrie's assistant admits that she borrows her pricey handbags from a rental website called Bag, Borrow, and Steal. One of the greatest success stories was Reese's Pieces in E.T. in 1982. Sales jumped 65% after it appeared in the film. Coca-Cola was the drink of choice by celebrity judges on American Idol. Miracle Whip, Virgin Mobile, and a total of 10 products were placed in Lady Gaga's Telephone music video, and it had more than 4 million viewers in the first 24 hours. Izzy appeared drinking Izzy sparkling juice in Grey's Anatomy, and The Biggest Loser showcased 4,000 brands in just 3 months. Many consumers feel the line between programming and advertising is becoming too fuzzy and distracting. Branded entertainment refers to products being showcased on longer-form narrative films. For example, the Lego Movie and Transformers were both based on children's toys. Branding is also being done in educational materials and in schools. For example, free book covers are provided to kids in some schools by Nike, Hershey, Crayola, Nintendo, and Foot Locker. We've talked about how advertising and fashion systems move meaning from cultural values and symbols to consumer goods. So what is a fashion system? A fashion system refers to the people like designers and organizations like manufacturers and promoters involved in creating or transferring meanings to cultural goods. Fashion affects all types of cultural phenomena, not just clothing. For example, music, art, architecture, and even science. For example, some research topics are hot at a given time. There are a number of terms that relate to fashion. They sound similar but have different meanings. For example, Fashion is the process of social diffusion by which a new style is adopted by some group of consumers. A fashion is a particular combination of attributes, for example, Danish modern furniture. In fashion refers to a particular combination of attributes that is currently positively evaluated by some reference group. There's a number of behavioral science models used to describe the origin and diffusion of fashion. There's psychological, economic, sociological, and even a medical model. In psychological models, various psychological factors help to explain why people are motivated to be in fashion. For example, the pressure to conform, variety seeking, the desire to be sexually attractive, or to demonstrate personal creativity, or perhaps a need for uniqueness. One of the earliest psychological theories was proposed by J.C. Flugel, a disciple of Freud. He suggested that our erogenous zones, the areas that arouse sexual interest, shift over time, and clothing styles change to highlight or hide these parts. Historically, fat was in, and now fitness is where it's at. For example, it was common for women in the Renaissance era to drape their abdomen with fabric to give a swollen appearance, as successful childbearing was a priority in the disease-ridden 14th century. Interest in the leg developed in the 20s and 30s with women's new social mobility and independence. Exposure of the breasts in the 70s signaled a new interest in breastfeeding. This was de-emphasized in the 80s when women started focusing more on their careers. Today, a larger bust size is now more popular as women try to combine professional activity with childbearing. Economic models of fashion are based on supply and demand. Rare items command respect and prestige, while common items are less desirable. What's interesting is that some upscale consumers engage in a parody display, deliberately avoiding status symbols by adopting formerly low status or inexpensive products like frayed jeans or even Jeeps. This reinforces that the conspicuous consumption approach, where the wealthy consume to display their prosperity, is outdated. Price has a big impact on demand. For example, the prestige exclusivity effect demonstrates that high prices still create high demand, and the snob effect shows that low prices actually reduce demand. If it's that cheap, it can't be any good. There's a number of sociological models of fashion. The collective selection model focuses on initial adoption by a subculture and later diffusion into society. It typically begins with youth subcultures. For example, goth started as a rebellion by young outcasts who admired 19th century romantics. They wore black clothing, often capes, studded collars, and black lipstick, and listened to Marilyn Manson. In the trickle-down theory, conflicting forces of subordinate and superordinate groups drive change. Lower-class subordinate groups try to adopt status symbols of the groups above them, while the upper-class superordinate groups are constantly looking below them to ensure they're not imitated. They respond by adopting new fashions. The two processes create a self-perpetuating cycle of change. The trickle-down theory was useful for understanding changes in a stable class structure that permitted easy identification of lower and upper-class consumers. The trickle-down approach must be modified for contemporary Western society to account for new developments in mass culture. First of all, mass fashion has replaced elite fashion because our media allows many markets to learn about styles simultaneously. Production technology allows companies like Zara to bring fast-changing fashions to market in as little as 2 weeks, and real-time media keeps us informed of style changes in minutes. Secondly, consumers are also more likely to be influenced by opinion leaders more similar to themselves than superordinate groups. And last of all, current fashions often trickle up from lower classes, since they're less concerned with maintaining the status quo and more free to take risks and innovate. For example, the influence of urban youth, inner city African Americans, and hip hop on mainstream vocabulary and fashion. There's also a medical model of fashion based on meme theory. A meme is an idea or product that enters the consciousness of people over time. For example, tunes and jingles, and phrases like "you're fired." According to meme theory, memes spread like a virus. They start out small and infect more people, multiplying in a geometric progression until it becomes an epidemic. You infect 2 friends, they each infect 2 others, and so on and so on. Memes that survive are distinctive and memorable. The diffusion of most products tends to follow the same basic path. The product is initially used by a few people, but change happens very quickly when critical mass is reached. It's like the boiling point. Some have referred to the tipping point as the point of critical mass. The fashion acceptance cycle is similar to the product life cycle. There are 3 stages: introduction, acceptance, and regression. Classics are fashions with an extremely long acceptance cycle. They're an anti-fashion in a sense, because they're stable and low risk. For example, Keds sneakers, introduced over 100 years ago in 1917. Keds tend to appeal to people who are turned off by the high-fashion, trendy brands like LA Gear and Reebok. In focus groups, Keds were described as a house with a white picket fence, a stable, classic product. On the other hand, Nike was described as a steel and glass skyscraper, reflecting their more modern image. Fads are short-lived and usually adopted by relatively few people. Adopters tend to belong to a common subculture, and fads trickle across members but barely break out of a group. They're typically non-utilitarian and don't perform a meaningful function, like a pet rock, for example. They diffuse or spread rapidly and tend to be quickly accepted, and they're often adopted on impulse. For example, hula hoops, jelly bracelets, and pet rocks. So how do we predict whether something will become a fad or a longer-term trend? Well, there are some guidelines. Longer-term trends tend to fit with basic lifestyle changes. For example, some hairstyles are difficult to maintain and may be inconsistent with increasing time demands. Long-term trends also tend to provide a real benefit. For example, switching to poultry and fish from beef is healthier. They can be personalized too. For example, a mohawk haircut is difficult to personalize, and they're not a side effect or a carryover effect. For example, increased interest in exercise is more likely to be a longer-term trend, while specific forms of exercise are often fads. Longer-term trends also tend to be adopted by important market segments. For example, if it's adopted by working mothers or baby boomers. The diffusion of innovation is the process by which a new product, service, or idea spreads through a population. So what is an innovation? An innovation is a product consumers perceive to be new. It may be a new manufacturing technique. For example, designing your own shoe at Nike.com, or a new product variation. For example, Parquet Fun Squeeze colored margarine in electric blue and shocking pink. It could be a new way to deliver a product. For example, Spud.ca delivers organic produce right to your door. Or a new way to package a product. For example, Campbell's Soup at Hand in a convenient microwavable travel mug. Successful innovations spread across the population. Adoption of innovations resembles the consumer decision-making sequence. Consumers move through stages of awareness, information searching, evaluation, trial, and finally adoption. The likelihood of adopting innovations is described by 5 categories of adopters: the innovators, the early adopters, the early and late majority, and the laggards. The innovators are more likely to have higher incomes and education levels and accept higher levels of risk, and they're the first to try a new offering. They represent about 2.5% of the population and tend to purchase in the introduction phase of the product lifecycle. The early adopters tend to be opinion leaders with rich social networks and concern about social acceptance. They represent about 13.5% of the population and tend to purchase in the growth phase. The majority represent about 68% of the population. They're split equally into the early majority and the late majority. They often purposely wait for technological improvements or price drops before adopting, and they tend to purchase in the maturity stage of the product lifecycle. The early majority are more deliberate in their decision to adopt. They weigh the pros and cons and wait to adopt an innovation after it's caught on with early adopters. The late majority are more skeptical of new innovations. They feel pressure to conform and adopt because their friends have. The laggards are suspicious of new products and tend to be tradition-bound. They're the last to adopt during the decline phase and represent about 16% of the population. There are 3 major types of innovations: continuous, dynamically continuous, and discontinuous innovations. They vary based on the amount of disruption or change they bring to our lives. Continuous innovations are evolutionary rather than revolutionary. They refer to modifications of existing products. For example, when Levi's introduced the shrink-to-fit version of its jeans, or when Cheerios introduced Honey Nut Cheerios. A dynamically continuous innovation is a more pronounced change to an existing product. For example, self-parking cars and credit cards you tap to pay. A discontinuous innovation creates major changes in the way we live. For example, major inventions like the airplane, the car, the computer, and the TV. Several factors are desirable for a new product to succeed. They relate to compatibility, complexity, relative advantage, observability, and trialability. The first factor is compatibility. The innovation should be compatible with consumers' lifestyles. For example, cream hair remover was introduced for men, but it was perceived to be too feminine. It wasn't seen as compatible with their self-image. The second factor is complexity. A product that's easy to understand will likely be chosen over a competitor's. The third factor is relative advantage. A product should offer a relative advantage over other alternatives. For example, Energizer green power batteries are better for the environment because they contain less mercury. The fourth factor is observability. Innovations that are easily observable are more likely to spread. For example, part of the iPad's success was that it was easy to observe other people using it and what benefits it could provide. The last factor is trialability. People are more likely to adopt an innovation if they can experiment with it before buying. For example, companies often distribute trial-size samples of new products to reduce the risk of trial. This concludes Chapter 13.